Okay, everybody, we're going to get rolling today. It's a beautiful day. Thanks for coming. My name is Ken Coles. I'm the Executive Director of Farming Smarter, and this is our final plot hop of the year during the COVID pandemic. The small crew that we have here live today has lots of opportunity to keep their space, and at the same time, welcome to our online friends. We've got a couple of cameras rolling. Hopefully you'll be able to experience as much as possible there, and maybe it might generate some content for later on in the winter months where you want to revisit there. We have a lot of interesting topics today. We're starting off about dryland grain corn agronomy. So first off, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Gurbir Dhillon, who's a new hire for us at Farming Smarter, soil scientist with us. Been recently working on a manuscript for a project that we worked on for 3 years on dryland grain corn. So there were a number of studies that we worked on and found some interesting results. What we're going to talk about after that is a new trial where we're sort of taking the next steps of what we learned, and we're looking at things like strip tillage and different heat unit varieties and seeding dates. And then we're going to follow up with Adrian Moens on some basic corn agronomy or advanced corn agronomy, however you want to look at it. And that's it for today's session. The rest of the day, I think we've got a few really great topics to talk about. Some fusarium head blight. We've got a desiccant demo that worked out really, really nicely, so I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. Mike is going to talk about fusarium head blight in another really cool trial led by Dr. Randy Kuchar from the University of Saskatoon. And Louis Bartas is going to talk about some sporinato studies that we have. Luckily, we've got Dr. Mike Harding, the provincial pathologist, that can help add a lot of interesting pieces to that topic as well. And we're going to wrap up the day looking at some drone type stuff. So hope you enjoy the day. I hope that the online folks will actually interact with us as well. We know that you're live people behind the screen there, so make sure you type in your questions and we'll address them as we go. So do it whenever you feel like, and Jamie will give us a shout and let us know what the questions are. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Gurbir, and he's going to share some of the quick findings from our previous study that sort of gives a segue onto this one.
Thank you for the introduction, Ken. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Blood Hub. I'm going to be briefly discussing a study that was conducted by Farming Smarter on grain corn management in South Alberta from 2015 to 2017. This 3-year study was carried out at 4 dryland locations in South Alberta, including here in Lethbridge, Vauxhall, Bow Island, and Medicine Hat. So the main goal of this project was to evaluate what are the best agronomic management practices for grain corn production under the climatic conditions here in South Alberta. And to do this, we did 3 separate experimental trials. In the first trial, we looked at the effect of plant population and row spacing on grain corn. In the second trial, we looked at the nitrogen fertilization rates, and in the third trial, we looked at the tillage systems and the crop rotation sequence and how that affects the grain corn production. I'm going to be discussing some of the major results from all of these trials, and so I'm going to be passing out these handouts that have some of the major results here. All right, so for the first study that was on row spacing and the seeding rate, we planted corn at 2 row spacings, 20 inch and 30 inch, and we had 5 different seeding rates varying from 15,000 to 35,000 seeds per acre. And we found that the yield of grain corn was higher on the 20 inch row spacing for all of the different seed rates. Also, another observation was that as the seed rate increased, the higher the seed rate, the higher was the yield, with the exception of the highest seeding rate at 35,000 seeds per acre, where there was a bit of a dip in the yield. So higher seed rate and narrow row spacings worked the best for corn production under these conditions. It could be because narrow row spacing and higher seed rate both help the crop to obtain an optimum canopy closure pretty quickly, which is really important here in the prairies because of the short growing season. So, with these higher populations and narrow spacings, the crop could obtain their canopy closure by June solstice, and that helps with the reduced evapotranspiration since less solar radiation is directly hitting the soil surface. Also helps with the weed management. So 28 spacings and 30,000 seeds per acre was the optimum seed rate. For the second trial, we looked at different rates of nitrogen ranging from 0 to 190 pounds per acre. We also use split application in which some of the nitrogen was side banded during seeding and the rest was applied in the crop. There wasn't much response of corn to nitrogen fertilization. The yield generally stayed the same for different rates, and it may be because under these dryland conditions, the soil moisture can sometimes be limiting. If the moisture is less, the nitrogen uptake decreases, and so the crop doesn't respond in the same manner to nitrogen fertilization. However, we did conclude that somewhere between 50 to 200 pounds per acre of total soil nitrogen is optimum for grain corn production here. For the tillage system, we used conventional tillage and the zero tillage. The conventionally tilled crop showed almost perfect emergence, close to 99%, and also the emergence was very uniform between the crops. The previous crop residue did not seem to affect the grain production too much. In case of zero tillage though, the emergence was lower. It was about 83% on average, and there was also a lot of variability depending on what the previous crop residue was. However, the differences in emergence did not affect the yield as much. So on the last page, there is the effect of yield from tillage, and the yield between the conventionally tilled systems and the no-till systems was pretty much the same. It was actually a little bit higher for no-till system, about 150 kilograms per hectare higher, but there was not a large significant difference between the two systems. Generally, for most of the crops, the zero-tilled plots gave either the same or higher yield compared to the conventional tillage, with the exception of canola and mustard residues. When corn was grown after following either canola or mustard, there was a decrease in yield. And the reason may be that both of these crops are non-mycorrhizal crops, so they do not host the mycorrhizal fungi in the soils. So when we sow corn after following either canola or mustard, there is not a pre-existing network of fungi in the soils, which is really important for phosphorus uptake, especially initially when the soils are cold. It's really important to have that fungal network to have a good phosphorus uptake going, and so that sometimes hurts the yield. So according to this study, no-till doesn't really lead to a decrease in yield, so that's good. But if we are following the no-till system, it's important to consider what was the previous crop that was grown in the sequence. These were the major results from this study. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll pass on to Adrian. Yes, please.
On your seeding depth, what depth were you at? Did you adjust it for the various conditions of the soil?
The question is on the seeding depth. Do you?
So in this study, we didn't pay attention to changing seeding depths as much as just making sure that it was consistent and to moisture. Although in the crop residue study, depending on what crop you were going into, the soil required a little bit of adjustment in the depth because it was a lot more mellow after lentils, say, versus corn on corn. And I think a lot of that variation and issues that we have seeding into different stubble has to do with that, as well as the residue itself. And that's actually what the next part of this study is about, is trying to figure out how to deal with that appropriately.
Okay.
Go ahead, George.
On the nitrogen fertilizer, that entry, is that total and soil test plus fertilizer, or just that?
That's right. It would be the question was on the nitrogen, the soil. It's soil test plus added. So in many cases we did have deficient nitrogen, but we were very surprised to see very little response to nitrogen. But remember, this is dryland corn, so we're talking 80 to 90 bushel corn at most, and lots of times I think the soil was able to meet the nitrogen needs of the corn. We're always used to hearing about corn being a really high nitrogen user. It's not actually all that different from, say, canola. It's just that you're sometimes putting out 200 or 250 bushels of corn. That's a lot more nitrogen. With a dryland scenario, and the 3 years that we did this study, not really a lot of moisture. So kind of, I think the last 3 to 4 years we've been in a drought situation. You're not hitting yield potential, and you're just not simply responding to that nitrogen. So this year we've got some good moisture. All of this corn behind us is dryland. Looking forward to sort of, I suppose, a more normal year to see what the results will be like on that front.
What's the heat rating of something? Because I see some of these already got nicely out the pass and actually calling it.
Yeah, well, I'll talk about that study in a minute.
I got one more follow-up before we move on.
Sure.
Like 3 years later, I thought of this. Because we were talking about the rotational effects, if we didn't see any yield differences with the nitrogen applications, why do you think we kind of saw something with putting on the corn and canola? Is it that strong of an effect, having that mycorrhizal?
I think, so to repeat, would you mind repeating the question? Do you have the mic on?
Yeah. So the question is that we didn't really see an effect with the nitrogen, but we did see an effect with the mustard and the canola. And so, is that much of an effect? Why did we see the effect in this case?
So, I think Adrian will touch on the mycorrhizal piece, but it's about that early yield setting. So when the soils are cool, Gurbir mentioned that in the spring, the ability for the plant to set its yield often happens early on in its growth stage. So that's my thought as to why. It's not a for sure answer. But sometimes that early yield setting is going to impact how the crop will do throughout the rest of the growing season.
Was there any difference in maturity?
Yep.
For sure.
1950 to 2250.
No, immaturity of the crop by previous residue.
Oh, okay. So the question there was there a difference in maturity based on the previous crop? Not as much as you'd think. And again, drought conditions, I think, sort of decides when it's going to hit maturity. It just sort of,
Maybe it didn't hit maturity, it just ran
it just ran
out of water.
out of water. Yep. Do you mind maybe passing me the mic?
Sure.
Thank you very much, Gurbir. I'm just going to take a few minutes to describe what we're doing next. A little bit of good background. You know, there's a few challenges in getting dryland grain corn adapted to our cropping systems. As we talked about, drought has been a big thing. This is an amazing year to see actual dryland crops, so it's just beautiful to see. And you can kind of see that there would be a lot more opportunity for a corn crop to really do well in a year like this. So the study that we have behind us is, you know, conventional corn, and I imagine is a good part of your corn acres are conventional. Is that right, Adrian?
Conventional
As in tilled land ahead of seeding?
Yeah.
So planters were designed really for a tilled environment, and being able to do a really good job in getting corn off to a good even start is so important. And there's new skills that we have to learn in using planters. So we've tried to adapt a planter with residue managers and side banding fertilizer openers and things like that. we're not there yet. So the industry needs to get up to speed in how to deal with those different crop residues, how to do a really good job of planting. Because I'll tell you, if you don't do a good job planting, you're not going to be happy with your crop. In fact, the plot behind us right here, this is our ugliest plot, and I stopped here on purpose. Although it is mature, this was seeded really early, April 22nd. So as growers in southern Alberta, we know through experience and through other research that seeding early is important. But Adrian, the corn agronomist, will say, whoa, hold down. You want to make sure that you've got the proper soil temperature and that you're doing a good job. So the trial behind us, we did 3 seeding dates. So, and in this case, we ended up April 22nd, May 8th, and May 19th. So you'll get to see that seeding early doesn't always work the best. This is seeding early in the zero-till scenario. So we made a couple of mistakes, probably. This spring was actually quite dry. So that depth that you're talking about, Jim, really mattered. Certain rows actually hit moisture and certain rows didn't, because we have offset openers on our planter. Didn't have it leveled quite perfectly. And we're talking about a 1/4 of an inch difference as to whether it germinated or not. I think Adrian will tell you that this is exactly what you don't want in a cornfield. You don't want to have mismatched growth stages, and that's just really, really bad for corn. So this was the zero-till piece here. And we'll actually walk down to where we did the strip till in early April, and it actually did a pretty decent job. So this is the strip till machine beside us. Thanks for revving your truck there, buddy. The idea of the strip till is rather than going to straight full out conventional tillage, you're just going to till exactly where you're going to be planting that corn. So you're preparing the seed bed, but you're also blackening up that soil. And that does a lot of different things. So this is becoming a pretty popular practice in the corn belt. It's sort of a halfway point towards zero tillage, but still allows the grower to say put their fertilizer down in the fall. So they'll deep band the immobile nutrients like potassium and phosphorus. In our case, we could actually put the nitrogen down possibly. So the trick though that we found is we tried to do this in the spring. The strip till machine work was done on April 20th. Honestly, it's kind of tricky to set these properly. We're not all that skilled in it. I don't think we did the perfect job of it, but the soil conditions weren't there to do a good job either. The moisture was pretty limited this spring, and we weren't able to actually get effective penetration. And then I think what happened is we came in and tried to seed, and it just didn't do the job that it should have. So I feel like a strip tillage approach does have some opportunities, likely better in the fall. It gives a chance for that soil to sort of settle and mellow, but to strip till and seed 2 days after, we had a mess. So our earliest seeding dates, we really just did the worst job possible, and this is how not to do it. Any questions so far? We're just going to take a quick walk down and look at a few plots, and then I'm going to pass it off to Adrian. So follow me, cameras. So I didn't mention it previously, but the question was sort of asked about heat units. The thought then is if we get a decent year and we have pretty reasonable heat units, here in Lethbridge we're sort of averaging 2,100 heat units a year, and it increases as we head east towards Medicine Hat up towards around 2,400. So folks that are selling the varieties, they have different offerings as far as heat unit corn. So is there an opportunity to say, okay, if we say seed it early in April, and because we strip tilled and we blackened up the soil, can we get away with growing a higher heat unit corn and actually get an increase in yield because of it? The higher the heat unit usually means the higher yield potential. So that's something that we're testing this year. So we have 2 heat unit varieties in the study, sort of a low one. Do you have the information on that?
Yeah, 6909, which is a 1950 heat units, and then a 7940, which is 2250 for heat units. Yeah.
There you go. So what we're looking at right now is actually the second seeding date, May 8th. Now, there was some rain events this spring that made a big difference. In fact, probably our last seeding date looks the best. And it's nothing like a good rain to sort of even out your mistakes and get good germination. But this is our second seeding date, May 8th. Still relatively early in the corn world. But if you look here, this is the no-till plot. Looks okay? What do you guys think? Reasonable? Let's take a shift over here and compare it to this one here. Do you see any differences? George says it's more even and it's actually a little bit taller. So this is the strip till. And that actually gets me a little bit excited because we've been scrambling through trying to figure out what's happening in these trials. It's pretty tough to see visually, but because there was a bit of time gap between the actual strip till pass, which was April 20th, it gave the soil some time to mellow. We probably got a rainfall. Now we got that much better of a seed bed. Now, this could be because of better depth control. It could be actually a soil warming effect. We're not too sure. So that's the point of the study, and we're looking forward to finding the results moving forward. So if you remember that ugly plot at the beginning, that was the earliest seeding date, April 22nd. Now we're going to take a little walk and look at the strip till of it. So this is April 22nd. It's already, yeah, it's tasseling. It's got anthers on there. It's starting to fertilize the corn heads. This is actually that ugly plot, the same seeding date, but with strip tillage. So if it's done right, there's a potential to actually do a good job. Now, I'm not going to tell you that this is the case in all situations. I think we still have a lot to learn. We've made mistakes, but this will be a 3-year study. We've got 3 locations here, Tabor and Medicine Hat. And remember, this is dryland. This is not irrigated, and we are going for grain corn. But I don't know, I'd be a lot more happy with an even crop like this. April 22nd, that's pretty early for seeding corn, hey? Any of your guys do that?
They have dabbled in it a few times.
Yeah, but it's risky, right?
Usually, and that's one of the things I was going to talk about too, yeah. They kind of regret it most of the time. So. And
I can tell you, after looking at all of these treatments in this study, and it's kind of a big, wide study, the later seeding dates, the consistency is just there. It's always more even. It may not be as big and tall right now, but that doesn't necessarily matter. It's what matters in the end, right? Yep. So with that segue, I'm actually going to pass it off to Adrian to talk about some of the general agronomy and advanced agronomy skills that are being employed here in southern Alberta. Is there any questions for me before I do, though? Thank you very much. Take it away, Adrian.
Well, thank you very much for asking me to present here. I'm Adrian Moens with AJM Seeds, based right out of just outside of Lethbridge here. This is my territory for Pioneer Hybrid. Been involved with corn for 25 years now, so still learning every year all the time. So a lot of the things that Ken and Dr. Gurbir, if I said that correct, sorry, touched on is kind of what I was going to be touching on as well. We like to see with corn, of course, there's the 4 outcomes of plantings that can influence the corn yield at the end. You got the uniform of plant emergence, plant timing, plant population, and evenness of the plant spacing. So in saying that, if you have corn that varies in emergence, it can cut in yield anywhere from 5 to 9%. You're wanting to ideally have a picket row fence, not only for the plant spacing but also for the plant emergence. The rule of thumb is you want to have every single plant come out of the ground in about 48 hours or so. That's going to be a little bit more ideal. Some of these guys that's down in the States where they're trying to go for these high yields, they're very picky. They'll make sure that everything's lining up, and they want to see within 24 hours a corn plant come out. That's not necessarily as easy for around here, and that's not always manageable in most situations, but that's what they'll strive for in order to get a better yield at the end. So you want to make sure that each plant each plant that comes out later than 48 hours or even a little longer than that can potentially have a little bit of a yield drag. You'll have, of course, those plants, if they're shorter, they're going to be in a negative effect as it is because they'll have less light penetrating them because the other plants beside it will be covering it out. They will take up a little less water, so they'll be competing with water and less nutrients. So, of course, with pollination timing, if you have plants, if a plant comes out of the ground a week later, it's never ever going to catch up. But a lot of guys will say, yes, you know, I planted it, but it's going to catch up. It never ever plants. It goes by growing degree days, and as it's growing, it will progress roughly around the same time. Sometimes, of course, if you have it too late, you're going to have a plant that's a little bit shorter, so it's being compromised by less sun, so it's even going to get pushed behind a little bit more. But that's an extreme case, of course. So that plant will not synchronize with silken and pollination timing as quick. So, of course, it's going to be even progress a little less behind. It's going to be behind. So, yeah, a couple of the different things that you will have having to the planting depth, seed trench compaction. That will, of course, help or hinder the emergence. Surface crusting, you know, got the seed furrow. If it doesn't close properly, then it could dry out a little bit more. Surface residue, so that comes back to the tillage, soil moisture. Of course, with dry land, it's going to be a little bit harder to work with the soil moisture because of the fact that you're dependent on so much in Mother Nature. That's the reason why some of these guys are trying to look for going earlier, is because they hope they catch the earlier rains. But it can lead to some frost events or anything like that. So planting timing. So ideally for our area, we always say May 5th to the 15th is the traditional plant timing for this area. You want to be a little bit careful, like I was mentioning, because if you go too early, you can get potentially what they have, if you get snow on there, so the plant will take up about 30 to 35% of its weight in water. So the very first 24 hours is very critical. If you're going to get a snow event or a real cold rain, and you plant in it right up to the time that it's going to snow or rain, that is where you're going to have the issues of what they call chill inhibition. It'll start sometimes growing underground or even corkscrewing, and it's just confused on where the warm is. It wants to go to the top where it's typically warmer, but if it's colder on top, it'll start growing down underneath instead. So ideally, you want to have soil temperatures of 10 degrees or warmer is going to be the optimal, but we have also recommended go ahead at 8 degrees as long as there's a warming trend. So then you could go, it'll keep on growing up from there. So planting too early, I was talking about the chill inhibition, but you also have the problem of frost risks. Now corn is fairly hardy that way. It may burn off the leaves, but the growing point, as long as it's not touched, it will continue to grow. And the growing point typically will not come out of the ground until about roughly, on the newer hybrids, they're saying more like 4-leaf stage. Traditionally, they always said 6-leaf stage. So 6-leaf stage is roughly around knee high. So you're looking at probably about halfway up or 3/4 ways up your knees, and that's when the corn will start pushing its growing point out of the ground. So if you get a heavy frost, or if you get hail or anything like that, and it hits that growing point and it turns brown after about 3-4 days, then you know that plant is done. But if that growing point stays green, it will push out a new leaf, and basically what you've lost is the bottom leaves. It's going to, the bottom leaves, I was trying to look for it, but the very first leaf is what they call a thumb leaf. It's in the shape of a thumb, and all the rest will always have the point. You count that very bottom leaf and every leaf after that, and that's where you're going to be at. So if your thumb leaf, if you find that, you know that you have your first true leaf, and as long as every leaf on the backside is a V or the collar, that will be what you're looking for. So every leaf will be on the opposite side of the stalk going up. And then as long as you could see, so this one right here, for instance, you could start seeing the collar on the bottom, but it's tucked way in there, so it's not a true leaf yet. Once it's elongated like this bottom one, then it's a true leaf. So that's where you would do your timing on the corn plant. Then the last one is plant population. So, or not the last one, sorry. What we have found in the past, we've done very little on dryland, but we have worked with some dryland customers that put on their corn on dryland. Traditionally, for the irrigation guys, we actually say we're bumping it up right around the 32 to 35,000, 36,000 kernels an acre. Depending on the hybrid, it's plant specific, hybrid specific. Depending on that, you might have to be a little lower, maybe a little higher. 34, 35, it seems like the sweet spot for us. Around this area, we're in mostly 15-inch to 22-inch corn planters. There's the odd 30-inch. 30-inch planters will go and have a lower seeding rate. You've got 30 inches wide, but then every plant in row is going to be roughly about 6.5, depending on your population. So that's the reason why it pushes it too close. When you get into 22, it's roughly around 9 inches, and 15-inch row spacing is roughly around 12 inches, depending on the population. So that's almost like a perfect square for these plants to grow in. For grain corn, though, there is no header to use on 15-inch rows. So if you want to go narrower, the 22 will be the narrowest, or 20-inch will be the narrowest grain corn header you could get. I like that row spacing. It seems like it does the best. The further north you go, so I'm talking from the States going up to here, it seems like the narrower row spacing, and also with the studies that Dr. Gurbir was saying, it does have a little bit more of a positive effect than the 30-inch row spacing. That's why most guys are going away from that. So one other reason we also go with, depending on your population, I have a couple of customers that are working with a fixed year product. So we get fixed year or flex year or a combination of it. Fixed year product is the ear itself, as most people say corn, cob, which is not really the cob, but it's the whole ear. If you have too high of a population, it's competitive against each other. But a fixed year will not throw a different number of kernels on that ear as big of an effect as a flex year would. So a lot of these guys will plant, we're getting guys that are planting 45,000 an acre on there, and their idea is they'll plant it quite a bit higher. The ear is going to be matured out anyhow. First of all, it's a lower heat unit product, and so that's not a problem, but it's not going to affect the yield as greatly as the flex year product. They will get more off per acre. So we had one customer. Now the one flex year product is a 2050 heat unit, so it's fairly early, and he was silaging it about 3 weeks before anybody else was starting. This was a couple years ago, and he got over 20 ton an acre, and it was down to 60% moisture already. So it just sped up the whole process, and he had really good luck on that. So on dryland, I was mentioning on irrigation, we're typically right around 35,000 kernels an acre, but dryland we've been going down to as low as 18 to 22,000. Each plant, of course, needs to compete with moisture. So if you have more plants in there, it needs the same amount of moisture, and you can't just turn on the tap. So the last part of that is the evenness of plant spacing. We were mentioning before, you want a picket row fence. So ideally you want to have every plant, if it's 9 inches apart or 9.5, whatever your seeding rate, spacing is, the width spacing, you want to have that consistently. You want to have it consistently in the ground at the same depth. We say no less than 1 3/4 inches. If you're going to 1.5 inches, or 1.5 inches is still acceptable, but if you have anything above that, what typically can happen is we could get what is called rootless corn. If the kernel's not deep enough, it's not going to produce the good enough brace roots to withstand any weather events, wind or storms and stuff, and it could lodge a little quicker. That's why we usually say 1 3/4 to 2 inches, 2 1/4 even. That's not a problem. But then you want it all consistently and spaced apart, so then each one will come out at the same time. Skips is, of course, something you want to try to avoid. First of all, whatever the skip is, you're going to have one less plant there. Every single plant will contribute to yield. Just because you have one skip doesn't mean you're going to be lower than not one, because the plants on either side, it's like the edge row effect. These ones traditionally should have a better yield on it than these plants here, because of the fact that it's going to catch more sun. So the studies have shown if you have one skip in there, that each plant beside there is going to produce about 110% of what it should be potentially, and that's because of that. If you have doubles in there, of course, both of those is going to be competing against each other, even though they might come up at the same time. Then you're going to still end up having 2 runts, if you want to call it that. It might still contribute to it, but it's going to be not to the max there. Oh, that's perfect. Okay. We're talking about grain corn, and of course, grain is a lot less forgiving than it would be for silage. Yeah, you want to have everything as perfect as possible for silage, but when you're going through there with the chopper, you're cutting in, and if you get a plant that is more of a runt, so it's not really as productive, at least it's not going to be throwing out a wet ear or wet grain compared to if you're combining. Same thing with spraying. We always recommend, if you're spraying your crop, kind of go on an angle, especially on grain corn, because you're going down the rows, and when you're picking it up, if you're picking one row that is stunted because of the spray track, you are going to be going the whole half mile, whatever you plant, and you're going to be combining that whole mile, that one row, and it's going to be typically wetter. If you're at an angle, you kind of hit it, next one. You just keep it going through at it. So. It's probably more if someone has questions.
I have a question, Adrian, what's more important, when you capture all the heat units or getting even emergence? Because in this part of the world we get 22, maybe 2300 heat units a good year, and you got a 2250 unit corn, and you seed a little bit later, you miss 50 heat units. So which is going to be more important?
Can you make sure you repeat that?
So what is more important? Capturing all the heat units, so a 2200 or 2400 heat unit year we have, for instance, or seed a little later and make sure your emergence is better. Well, it's kind of a hard one to say, because for the dry land, I think it's going to be, we're traditionally, if we're talking about all these plots here, you're traditionally going to be struggling with moisture. So you want to make sure you get in early, not only for the moisture, but then hopefully capture as much heat units. Grain is going to be less forgiving too, because of the fact that you're going to have potentially a less of a year, because it takes longer to fill out. Ideally, you don't want to put it in too early and then let it sit there. Because you're going to get a lot more unevenness, and I think it's going to be still better to have a more even crop and just make sure you adjust your heat units based on that. because of the fact that you're just going to end up having tall plants, short plants, immature plants and stuff. So.
Well, join me in thanking Adrian and Gurbir. And we're going to head off to talk to Mike on some Fusarium head blight next. Thanks. Thank you, Adrian.